They say some places exist outside the grasp of reason, where even silence feels like a living thing pressing against your skin. Travelers whisper about them, scientists ignore them, and locals refuse to utter their names after dark. The one you are about to hear of is not marked on maps, not listed in official archives, yet generations of stories have kept its shadow alive. The only invitation is curiosity, and those who accept it rarely return unchanged. If you believe you have the courage, then listen closely, for this is a story you must see with your own eyes if you can. It begins in a forgotten valley, tucked away from roads, where mist lingers year-round. The air is always damp, clinging to skin like the breath of something unseen. Few who pass through the nearby villages linger long enough to notice it. The people there offer warm smiles, but when asked about the valley, their expressions falter. They call it cursed ground, a place best left alone. The strange part is, they never explain why. They simply grow quiet, as if even speaking of it might awaken something. 4 young explorers decided to ignore those warnings. Each of them carried their own reasons, though none would admit them out loud. To the world, they claimed they were documenting abandoned sites for an online series. In truth, each was chasing something deeper: proof, fame, or an answer to questions that had haunted them since childhood. Together, they followed rumors until they stood before the mouth of the valley, the sun already heavy with the weight of dusk. The first thing they noticed was the silence. No birds, no insects, only the crunch of their own steps. Even their voices seemed muted, as though the valley swallowed sound whole. It unnerved them, but none wished to be the first to admit fear. They carried cameras, flashlights, and recording gear, pretending the technology could shield them from the growing unease. Their laughter was forced, too sharp, too quick. Beneath it was the quiet tremor of dread. As they pushed deeper, the air grew colder. A fine mist drifted through the trees, forming shapes that dissolved when touched. One of them, Daniel, paused to shine his light into the fog. He swore he saw a figure standing still among the trunks. But when the beam cut through, nothing remained. He laughed nervously, brushing it off as a trick of his imagination, but his eyes darted back often, betraying his doubt. Further in, they found remnants of structures, crumbling walls hidden beneath vines, fragments of stone pathways half swallowed by roots. The valley had once been alive with human hands, though no records remained of who built it. A place once lived in, now left for the earth to reclaim. The sight should have sparked wonder, but instead it stirred unease. The ruins looked less abandoned and more devoured, as if time itself had been hungrier here. One of the group, Sarah, knelt beside an old foundation stone. She traced strange markings etched into its surface, worn but still sharp enough to read. The symbols were unfamiliar, looping and jagged, as though carved by someone in haste or desperation. She pulled out a notebook to copy them, but her pencil snapped before she finished the first line. A trivial detail, perhaps, but it rattled her more than she admitted. Hours slipped by, though none could recall how many. Their watches ticked steadily, yet the sky seemed reluctant to move. Dusk clung stubbornly to the horizon, never darkening fully, never allowing true night to fall. The explorers argued quietly over whether they had been walking for minutes or days. Their hunger told them one thing, their memories another. Still, they pressed forward, compelled by something they couldn't name. The deeper they ventured, the stranger the valley became. Trees twisted unnaturally, their branches stretching in patterns that resembled skeletal hands. The soil beneath their boots was soft, damp, as though freshly turned. At times, they thought they saw footprints beside theirs, faint impressions that vanished when examined. Each time they reassured themselves: animals, coincidence, tricks of the light. But the excuses grew weaker with every step. Eventually, they reached a clearing. At its center stood the remnants of a large building, its walls blackened as though from fire. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though no flame had touched the place in centuries. Windows gaped like hollow eyes, and vines crawled over the stones like veins feeding a corpse. They hesitated at the edge, each waiting for someone else to lead. It was David, the most skeptical among them, who stepped forward first. He laughed, called it just another ruin, and dared the others to follow. His bravado cracked only slightly when a gust of wind slammed against the building, rattling the hollow frame like bones in a coffin. The others joined him, though reluctantly, their nerves stretched taut. Inside, the air was colder still. Dust hung heavy, disturbed only by their movements. Every sound echoed too long, as if reluctant to fade. They found remnants of furniture, splintered wood, shattered glass. Yet everything seemed positioned deliberately, as though preserved in the moment of some violent end. On the far wall, scorched symbols matched those Sarah had traced earlier. She froze, whispering that they weren't random carvings but some form of ritual script. The others scoffed, unwilling to acknowledge the fear in her voice, but each felt the same unease. The symbols seemed alive, lines twisting faintly when viewed from the corner of the eye. No one spoke of it, but all avoided staring too long. They pressed deeper into the ruin. Daniel's camera whirred softly, recording everything. When he checked the playback, he frowned. The screen showed flickers of movement in places none of them had been standing. Pale shapes darting past, too quick to identify. He tried to show the others, but the device glitched, static tearing through the footage. When he rewound, the figures were gone. Leela, the quietest of the group, suggested leaving. Her voice trembled, though she tried to mask it with logic. They had enough footage, enough notes. Why risk more? The others dismissed her quickly, driven by the allure of uncovering something no one else had dared to document. She fell silent after that, though her eyes flickered constantly to the shadows. As they explored the final chamber, they stumbled upon something that froze them all. In the center of the floor lay a circle of stones, blackened and cracked. Within the circle, the soil was unnaturally dark, damp despite the dry air. Around it were fragments of bones, animal perhaps, though the shape seemed disturbingly human. None spoke for a long time, the weight of the discovery pressing down like a physical hand. Finally, Sarah whispered that it was a ritual site, a place of offerings. Her words barely carried, yet the air seemed to shiver at the sound. David scoffed again, though his laughter rang hollow. He kicked one of the stones aside, dismissing the arrangement as nothing more than coincidence. The instant his boot struck, a chill swept through the chamber, extinguishing their flashlights in a single breath. For a moment they stood in perfect darkness. The silence roared, heavier than sound. Then, faintly, came the whisper. It carried no direction, no origin, only the unmistakable tone of a voice not their own. 3 words repeated again and again, threading through their minds like a curse. You shouldn't be here. When the lights flickered back, the circle of stones was gone. The floor lay smooth, undisturbed, as though it had never existed. David stumbled back, his face pale, his bravado shattered. None spoke, none dared. The cameras continued to hum softly, recording, though no one checked them again. Something had changed. The valley no longer felt abandoned. It felt aware. Watching, waiting. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, as if the valley itself resented their presence. The mist no longer drifted gently but clung thick around their legs, pulling at them like unseen hands. Every breath tasted metallic, bitter, as though laced with rust. The group's voices grew quieter, not out of choice but necessity. Each word seemed to echo unnaturally, bouncing back distorted, as if repeated by someone unseen. Daniel tightened his grip on the camera, though he no longer dared glance at the playback. Something about the footage unsettled him. Every time he dared review it, shadows shifted where none should exist, and faces appeared half-formed in corners they hadn't noticed. He stopped checking altogether, telling the others the batteries were dying. But he didn't tell them the truth, that the last recording had shown Sarah standing still in the background, though she had been walking right beside him at the time. The group's exhaustion was beginning to show. Leela's steps faltered, her eyes rimmed red as if she hadn't slept for days. She confessed in a whisper that she no longer knew how long they had been in the valley. Time, she said, refused to make sense. She felt older, as though years had passed since they entered. The others tried to dismiss it, but they too noticed their watches no longer agreed. One showed hours, another only minutes. It was as if time itself fractured within this place. The forest pressed closer, trees warping into grotesque shapes. Their branches arched unnaturally overhead, forming a canopy that blocked the remaining light. In the gloom, shapes seemed to crawl just out of sight, low, hunched figures scuttling between roots, vanishing whenever flashlights swept their way. At first they thought it must be animals, but the movements were too deliberate, too synchronized, like shadows imitating life. David's bravado had been stripped away entirely. His earlier laughter was gone, replaced by silence and a darting gaze. He muttered occasionally under his breath, swearing he heard footsteps matching their own, always one step behind. When he turned, nothing but mist lingered, but the crunch of those phantom steps persisted, keeping rhythm with his every movement. The breaking point came when they stumbled upon a second ruin, half buried in earth. Unlike the first, this structure still carried the faint outline of rooms. They stepped cautiously through broken doorways, their lights cutting across peeling walls. This place felt less abandoned and more paused, as if waiting for its inhabitants to return. Furniture stood where it had been left, though rotted and brittle. A cracked mirror leaned against the far wall, its glass clouded yet strangely reflective. Sarah approached it, drawn by something she couldn't name. When she peered into the mirror, her reflection blinked a moment late, its mouth curving into a smile she didn't wear. She gasped and stumbled back, her voice strangled in her throat. The others rushed to her side, but when they looked, the mirror showed nothing unusual. Still, none dared to stand near it again. They left quickly, yet not quickly enough to shake the weight of that distorted grin. The further they traveled, the more the valley began to bleed into them. Whispers threaded through the air, each carrying their names, spoken in tones that mimicked their own voices. Daniel swore he heard Leela calling him, though she walked silently beside him. David claimed Sarah spoke to him in the dark, though she hadn't uttered a word in hours. The place was tearing at their trust, feeding doubt into every glance. When night finally fell, if it could be called night, it did so without warning. The last sliver of dusk blinked out like a candle snuffed in a storm. The forest became pitch black, forcing them to rely on their dim lights. Yet the darkness here felt alive, pressing in close, swallowing the weak beams. No matter how they turned, the light never seemed to travel far, as if the air itself drank it. That was when they heard the first scream. It echoed from deep within the forest, human yet distorted, as if stretched too long. They froze, each waiting for another to dismiss it, to call it an animal, a trick. But none did. The sound returned, closer this time, and the forest seemed to vibrate with it. Against better judgment they followed. The scream pulled them forward, each step heavier than the last. The path twisted nonsensically, trees bending into shapes that defied natural order. At last they emerged into another clearing, and the sound cut off abruptly. What lay before them turned their stomachs cold. In the center of the clearing was a pit, shallow at first glance, yet impossibly dark, as if light itself refused to enter. Around it were scattered bones, far too many to be dismissed as animals. Skulls grinned up from the soil, some cracked, others gnawed. The group recoiled, gagging at the sight. Leela whispered that this must be where the missing had gone, those villagers never spoken of, their ends buried in silence. As they stood frozen, the air shifted again. From the pit rose a low moan, not quite human, not quite wind. It grew louder, resonating in their chests, rattling their teeth. The ground trembled faintly, the soil quivering like flesh. They staggered back, but the sound pursued them, weaving around their heads like invisible fingers clawing at their minds. Sarah clutched her notebook, scribbling frantically even as her hands shook. She muttered about patterns, about something binding this place, some cycle feeding itself. Her voice rose, hysterical, until Daniel shook her roughly, breaking her from the trance. But the damage had been done. Her notes revealed symbols repeating over and over, the same as those carved in the ruins, the same as those on the scorched stones. A loop, A snare, a trap disguised as ground. The terror solidified when the first of them vanished. It happened in an instant. David, who had begun pacing at the edge of the clearing, muttering that they needed to escape, suddenly faltered. One step carried him forward and then he was gone. No sound, no scream, only the faint rustle of mist closing where he'd stood. The group rushed to the spot, calling his name, shining lights desperately into the fog. Nothing. His footprints ended abruptly as though he had been erased mid-step. Silence followed. The valley had claimed him. Leela collapsed, sobbing, while Sarah stood rigid, her face drained of color. Daniel called out again and again, though each cry came back warped, repeating his words in a chorus that wasn't his. The voices overlapped, mocking until he fell silent. The reality pressed in. They were no longer explorers in ruins. They were prey inside something's domain. The choice now was simple but impossible: flee and risk being consumed like David, or push forward and hope for an end. With trembling steps, they chose the latter. The valley had already marked them. There was no turning back. They moved forward in silence, each step an act of defiance against the terror that clawed at their minds. David's sudden disappearance hung over them like a curse, a reminder that the valley claimed without warning, without reason. Every glance over their shoulders revealed nothing but mist, yet each of them felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing from every direction. The forest no longer looked like trees. The trunks leaned too close, bending in unnatural arcs as if listening. Daniel gripped the camera tighter than ever, though he no longer believed in documenting anything. The machine had become a talisman, the whirring sound of fragile comfort against silence that threatened to consume them whole. Leela stumbled often, her breath ragged, her eyes unfocused, yet she forced herself to continue. Sarah muttered symbols under her breath like prayers, clutching her notebook as if the pages might anchor her sanity. None of them dared speak louder than a whisper. It was then the valley shifted again. The path that had seemed to lead deeper suddenly bent back on itself. No matter which direction they chose, they found themselves circling the same clearing, the same pit, the same scatter of bones. It was a labyrinth without walls, a maze of time and space twisting endlessly. Panic grew sharper with each loop. They marked trees, yet the marks vanished when they returned. They tried to leave items behind, but every time they circled, the objects were gone. The valley devoured proof as hungrily as it devoured people. On the third loop, Sarah froze. In the distance, she saw David. He stood just beyond the mist, motionless, his back turned. She called out instinctively, her voice cracking, but the figure didn't move. When Daniel raised his flashlight, the beam cut through the fog, and the shape dissolved like smoke. Leela screamed, insisting it hadn't been him at all, that the valley was showing them ghosts to weaken their resolve. Daniel didn't argue. He too had seen the figure, but he knew deep down that David was no longer human if he existed at all. The forest grew crueler. Roots rose like serpents, tripping them without warning. Whispers now carried their own voices, perfectly mimicked, calling from behind, from above, from within the mist itself. Sarah's name echoed again and again, sometimes in Daniel's tone, sometimes in David's. She pressed her hands over her ears until her nails drew blood, yet the voices threaded through bone and marrow, unavoidable. When they stumbled into the ruins of another structure, it felt less like discovery and more like entrapment. This building stood more intact than the others, its roof still partially whole, shadows clinging thickly inside. Against every instinct they entered. The air was heavy, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were breathing. Furniture remained here too, but better preserved, unnervingly so, as if abandoned only yesterday. A faint warmth radiated from the fireplace, though no fire burned within. On the mantel lay photographs, sepia-toned images of families whose faces were scratched out. Each picture was marred by deep gouges where eyes once had been. Sarah's hand trembled as she lifted one frame, only to drop it with a gasp. The faces weren't strangers. They were theirs. The four of them, caught in the photograph, standing in the valley they were in now, though none remembered posing for such an image. Their expressions were blank, their eyes hollow black pits. The photo cracked on the ground. Leela begged them to leave, her voice sharp with hysteria, but the door behind them no longer led outside. Where wood and hinges should have been was now solid stone, seamless as if it had never been a door at all. They rushed to other exits, only to find each one sealed in the same unnatural way. The house had swallowed them. The temperature plummeted, frost forming across the glassless windows. Their breath puffed white, their skin prickling with cold. Daniel tried to smash a wall with a broken chair, but the wood splintered uselessly, leaving the stone unmarked. Sarah dropped to the floor, scrawling symbols onto her notebook pages, as if hoping to mirror what she'd seen carved into the ruins. She whispered frantically about openings, about binding and release, her pen cutting jagged lines that tore the paper. It was Leela who noticed the figure first. At the end of the hall, a shadow darker than night itself peeled away from the wall. It had no face, no form, only the suggestion of limbs and an outline that seemed to bleed into the air around it. It did not walk, it glided, each movement smooth, wrong. The group stumbled back, hearts hammering, yet the figure made no sound as it drew closer. Daniel raised the camera instinctively, the lens trembling. Through it the figure appeared sharper, more defined. A tall, skeletal shape with eyes like hollow lanterns glowing faintly red. The sight made him recoil, dropping the device, but the whirring continued on the floor, capturing what none of them dared to watch. The shadow stopped within a few feet. Silence crashed down heavier than ever, so loud it pressed against their skulls. Then in a voice that was not one voice but many, overlapping in tones they recognized and tones they didn't, it spoke. "You are mine now." The words rattled through them, not through their ears but inside their heads. Sarah screamed, clutching her notebook to her chest. Leela collapsed against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably. Daniel stepped in front of them without thinking, though his body shook with terror. The figure tilted, not like a human tilts its head but like a puppet pulled on crooked strings. Then it dissolved, melting into smoke that bled across the room, seeping into walls, into floors, into their lungs. The house shuddered violently. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, the floor split in jagged lines. They scrambled, clinging to each other as the structure seemed to collapse inward. And then, as quickly as it began, it ended. Silence returned. The house was gone. They were back in the forest, though none had seen how, but something followed them out. They could feel it, lingering in their chests, their skin, their blood. The valley was no longer only around them, it was inside them.